Okay, so I thought we'd get back together here. It's been a while. I'm sure we've all been busy and, dodging viruses and stuff like that. And I think for me, I wanted to get back and just to see how everybody's doing. But most of all, obviously just get into some conversations here. There's a lot going on. I put a whole bunch of different things on my list and I figured we just go after it. And I think one of the first ones was interesting. Like I'm talking to different people about injuries, mostly in the NFL, and just trying to figure out. I think they're almost at about 50 ACLs, and they still have got a good amount of season to go. And everybody's trying to figure it out. Everybody's trying to use science and predict this, and exercise, and it doesn't seem to be working. And so I hear, and I'll get Rob to start on this because we talk about it, and then get people like Jim and others to jump in. But is this all for naught? Is it just everybody's kind of just making it seem like they're doing something, or posturing, or giving the impression that they're doing something, and yet we still get 50 to 60 ACLs in the NFL just because? What are your thoughts on this? And we'll get a whole bunch of people to jump in. But Rob, I'm curious. We talk about this weekly, and it just doesn't seem to be improving.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's two factors. I think it's a factor of conditioning and getting in shape. Now that said, when I used to work with Coach Parker in the off seasons with the Giants, we used to have 20 to 22 weeks in the off season with the players. You don't have that anymore at the CBA. However, if the players are working with their own personal guys and they're training very well, then that would take that off the table. And I think the second factor is turf. I think, there's been some studies in the past, and, I think turf contributes to these injuries versus playing on natural grass. Natural grass is a slower game, and you don't have the coefficient of friction or the grip strength on the cleat like you do with turf. So, my knee-jerk reaction are those two things, whether I'm right or wrong.
Yeah, that was interesting. I talked to 3 different strength coaches who are in the NFL, and they thought, one of them was saying that it was just the combination of the intensity and the speed and the workload through the season. And then this idea that the players really aren't doing enough in the off season to handle that. Like, they might, like you said, they might work with a personal trainer. They might be doing stuff, but they're not doing it at the volume and intensity to create that reserve that moves into the field and allows them to handle it throughout which is now a 17-game season.
Yeah. Well, there's 2 arguments with the workload. All right, because so someone popped up the question about overuse. I do believe that fatigue contributes to injury. I do, because I just think that kinesthetic sense, your technique, everything suffers, right? The argument that, and a guy named Tim Hewitt will argue this, and I respect him. He's a really bright guy, and he has some validity in his statement, is that, well, if you're fatigued and you're not going to put out as much force, right? So, there's less force into the ground, there's less reactive force, and you should be able to tolerate that. So there are some arguments, and as well as some other things, that will omit fatigue and overuse for ligament type injuries. So I don't know.
Yeah, some of those studies are interesting though, Rob. Like they'll do pre-fatigue and then test people biomechanically, but the pre-fatiguing could be like go run a mile like 4 times, or
that's part of the problem with some of them. But that said, I do respect him and I do respect his work, and I think there is some validity there. However, if you put a gun to my head and say, which camp are you in? I would say, fatigue is not a good thing. I would believe that fatigue does contribute for other reasons to injury.
Yeah, and it's not just aerobic fatigue. It's this accumulation of game after game after game wearing you down, and then you don't have that coordination. Jim, what are your thoughts on this? And I honestly don't follow like baseball injuries as closely, but I know there's probably some similar factors in there.
Yeah, I mean, an ACL isn't the same. You don't see that as much in baseball. I think, the question I have, if you've looked at the numbers, is across those number of injuries, how many of them are contact versus non-contact?
I would say, based on my
question.
data, the majority are non-contact now, and you'll very
Yeah.
rarely have somebody take a shoulder in the knee or get rolled up. Well, you still get people rolled up on, but it's guys in the middle of open space cutting, and then the knee collapses inwards. That's very common.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've seen it. I mean, I remember seeing it happen 30 years ago, on the turf that was worse. As a player, I'll never forget my first year as a coach, coaching football and just watching. We had a pretty good running back, D3, but we had a pretty good stud running back. And opening game of the year, he made a cut, and I'll never forget just watching him crumble to the ground. Again, the turf in 1989 wasn't quite the turf it is now, but I think it's an interesting discussion because no one's cracked that code, right? Players are bigger, players are faster, players are stronger. Like Rob said, the force and the physics on their connective tissues. Are they not growing up as resilient because they're not as the diversity of their physical stresses, playing multiple sports is not the same across the board that it used to be, although we do see number of elite level athletes that were multi-sport participants. It's hard to say. I mean, obviously the person that can come up with cracking that code is going to make themselves a fortune if they can bottle it up and market it. Baseball, obviously the big thing in baseball is UCL injuries, and why is that happen? Is it because we're just more aware of it than we were 30 or 40 years ago? It's hard to say because they clearly, to my recollection, weren't keeping track of that stuff like they keep track of it now. So I don't know, but I know that baseball wise, you're not running into the ACL injuries like you are in football. But baseball's a lot less reactive. It's less chaotic. It's a lot less reactive.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was asking Rob, and we talked about this, and is there a wear and tear component? I think somebody asked it in the chat, like in terms of ACLs, like if you're making those cuts, are you wearing down the ACL? Is there proof that that's happening? Because of all the repetitions and the turf and the Eric Kozlowski. I know there's been people talking about like it is the turf, but there's a lot of turf in college, but we don't see necessarily the same incidents as maybe the NFL based on some of the stats that I've seen. What do you think's going on, Eric?
Hi guys, excuse me. Over the last year, so I start thinking that maybe our guys just don't have appropriate recovery. From a AT standpoint, looking at what a football coach does to a guy, we're not going to have much impact on what workload they give to a kid. Our strength coach can put them as close as they can, and we try to measure those things before we return a guy to play. But it sure seems like the coaches are going to ramp them up a little bit, and if a guy doesn't get a chance to regen or recover enough, I think this is leading to some of these injuries that we're talking about, whether it's from neurological level or muscle reaction time. Like that's where I think we're coming from.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. It just we have a little different factor when our freshmen come in from basic training. They've got about 6 weeks of additional wear and tear, and if we have a kid that comes in with a shoulder surgery or a knee surgery that has not had a season, they usually fail. One good thing is we're allowed to pull them out, rehab until they're ready to go. But sometimes we miss them. The kids think they feel good, and then they're injured and having another surgery.
Eric, can I ask you a question? When Army and Navy are playing, are you cheering for anyone?
I really hate them both. It was a little strange watching yesterday. I remember as a kid growing up thinking how boring a game it was. It means a little bit more to me now. It means more when we're in the hunt. If we think we're going to have a chance to win the Commander in Chief, in which we didn't this year. For a long time, Army wasn't much of a challenge. And now they've been really tough these last few years. So they're probably a little more disliked than Navy at this moment. But it was fun to watch those kids play. Um, I'm partial, of course, to Air Force, but it's they don't even mention us in the thing, and we seem to have won a lot more of those trophies. And at least over time, we haven't been as successful as we should have been lately.
Yeah, well, it was an exciting game. I thought,
Yeah.
just the fanfare around it and everything. So I was thinking of you while I was watching. Coach Alejo, are you driving? Or are you just sitting in the parking lot somewhere?
Well, my little birthday party with the teenage son over at Dave and Buster's. And so I came over here to Pete's Coffee, and I can't think of a better time to spend with this group than to sit in my car facing Moore Park Boulevard.
So we're just talking about injuries and they keep piling up. Is it's just something we have to deal with and, next man up, or do you have some solutions based on your experience?
You can't dismiss the fact that there could be some COVID lack of preparation still happening there, right? We've seen, we had a really good study out of the NFL that I read. They compared the season with, I think, the 4 previous seasons prior to the season where they went right into playing, and the numbers are, I wouldn't say staggering, but they hit you right in the face for sure. So there is something there to, being ill prepared. And I'm not sure that doesn't carry over even into the next year, because you still haven't had that developmental period, right? And I think we haven't seen really an uptick at my school, but we saw a few things there, right? We're like, oh, okay, that makes sense, because now these kids are home collegiately, and they don't, at least at our school, our demographic doesn't always have access to golds and 24-hour fitness and all that, right? So, then they come, and then, coaches want to play right away, and they want to get busy, which, they missed what they were doing, just like we were, when they want to get kids out on the field and kicking the ball and throwing it and hitting it and whatever else they do. And, I think that's really our role, probably is as critical as anything right now, making sure that load isn't too much. But I don't think, I don't, is fatigue a problem? I don't know. I think if you have to, really have a grip on what's going on, though fatigue is a problem, then my question is, were you waiting for that to happen? Shouldn't there have been something in place already? If I think of load monitoring at all, and give or take where you hear the information from, you can just take it with a grain of salt. But if that was anywhere more prevalent, or any time more prevalent, it should have been when everybody came back from COVID.
Yeah. And how much of that load monitoring is happening under the eye of the head coach and influencing that coach's dispensing of workload? Like, I don't necessarily see that happening, where somebody's going up to a head coach and saying, hey, we're 20% over what we should be, and that's why we're getting these injuries. And he's like, okay, well, we'll cut the practice by 20%. Has anybody seen that? Is that happening anywhere? Anybody can jump in here. I don't know.
That goes right back to my regular old argument. Oh, we got to do this and that. And I say, damn it, that's a leadership situation. That's because we have people overseeing the performance units that couldn't know what we were doing, number one. And number two, aren't going to allow us with full backing to say, coach, that's too much. We need to stop. 20%, that's not enough. 50% or a day off might be enough, but so who's watching that, right? And that's been my bitch all along, for the position that I hold now, to get somebody in that spot that knows what the heck everybody else is doing, but also has the support of the athletic director to go do that. And if the athletic director can do it, but they don't have the support of the president or the chancellor, then it doesn't really matter. So really, it's a leadership thing, unless athletic trainers, strength coaches, whatever, are just not doing their business and kind of acquiescing to the whole, hierarchy of performance where the head coach sits on top. That's an obvious mess.
Yeah, absolutely. Gianluca, you want to jump in?
Hey guys, do you hear me properly?
Yep.
That's good. I'll give you like my perspective because so I have buddies down south that work at like Texas Tech and Utah State, and what they told me was because they work with like GPSs, right, to determine like guys' speed on the field and all that fun stuff. And at Texas Tech, what they managed to do is the coaching staff and the strength staff are really a unity where they talk a lot and they make sure that there's a good amount of information that's flowing up and down, so everybody knows and is aware of what's happening. I'll give like at my school, like I'm at University of Ottawa, and it's like really difficult because our head coach has like an old school mentality, right? So I have to educate him a lot on like what's new, what's happening, what needs to be done, how do we monitor these kids. So like going back to the person who was talking before me, it's like that's where I think we benefit and the kids would benefit and the athletes would benefit, is that conversation going up and down, right? Where we're educating them and they're understanding like if your guys are hitting top speed during the week too many times, like you're gonna smoke them, right? So I think that's where everybody would benefit, is just having a up-down conversation and really understanding like how much an athlete really needs to be pushed, but also how much he needs to recover for it.
Yeah, and this goes back to leadership, and I know people like Jim and Bob have talked about this. And I was speaking to somebody who is a strength coach in the NFL, and we're talking about, do the coaches, the head coaches and the GMs, do they know who to hire? And he said, well, he was talking to somebody and they said, oh yeah, we're looking at the strength coach and we're going to hire this guy. I said, okay, well, what was your process for hiring him? I talked to him on the phone for 30 minutes. And so, right then and there, you're like, wow, okay, you just got a good vibe from him, or, do you know what he does? So I think, at some point, and maybe Jim, you can chime in here. Do we have to really change the way people are hired and not give so much freedom to like, hey, let's just get my buddy over here that I work with at the previous school?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's obviously a big discussion. And I think it varies by sport and by school or situation, right? When you are empowering, let's start with the NFL, right? What I think what you see more now in the NFL than you used to is if you have a good synergy between the strength conditioning staff and the athletic training staff, which we'll just say, is your performance staff, you're seeing more guys last through multiple head coaches. Because I think there are a lot more moving parts. While at the NCAA level, it's still a huge business, it's still not quite the NFL. And if an NFL coach comes in and doesn't necessarily absolutely have his guy, then they're probably going to be a little more open to the idea of like, well, let's look if he's prescient enough to like look at the injury history and what's going on and how's the working relationship, and more importantly, am I not going to have to deal with the headache of an athletic trainer and a strength coach that don't get along? Then why mix it up? Eric Ciano's been with the Bills now for 10, 12 years through multiple head coaches. Look at Milo down in Jacksonville prior to this new staff coming in with its own set of issues. Milo lasted through a number of coaches. I think that the NFL is a little bit more like what baseball traditionally is. Baseball, a manager doesn't roll in and generally have his strength coach. There may be an outlier situation where that happens, but not for the most part. For the most part, the strength coach and the athletic training staff, they're really kind of lumped a little bit more together. And, you're even seeing guys traditionally in that role that aren't even calling themselves strength coaches anymore, right? They're performance specialists or athlete preparation people, whatever you want to call it. I still prefer the term coach. That's who I am and how I've always been. Now, on college level, right? Those coaches hold all the juice at those upper level schools. They are exerting probably more influence they should over the athletic trainers. They're running the show how they want to run the show, because there's a ton of pressure from alumni. There's a ton of pressure from boosters and donors, and it's win or go home, and money be damned, right? We're seeing all kinds of money just being paid to people to not work or what have you. And they talk about culture and mental toughness, and right or wrong, they're just going to be empowered they're going to be handed their $3 or $4 million in support staff money, and they're going to chop that money up how they see fit. And again, the strength conditioning coaches are the guys that really probably spend the most time of anybody with those athletes. So if culture and mindset is going to be more important to that head coach than sort of practical, well thought out training, then it's going to be what it's going to be.
How much, thanks for that, Jim. How much, if we talk about, say, injuries, like we'll always say with injuries, like I saw an article like, oh, the Cleveland Browns have a lot of injuries, it must be the strength coach. Is that a fair assessment? How many people look at the head coach? And I'll let Rob jump in on this one. Rob's got his hand up here, but I want Rob to kind of, does anybody look at the way the head coach runs practice and some of these loads that we're talking about and say like, wow, this guy's running like, full kickoffs like for an hour. Maybe this is the problem, right? What do you think, Rob? Should everybody be evaluated when it comes to injuries?
Yeah, I think everybody should be evaluated. But the question I have two questions, and many of you are familiar with Franklin Pacelli's work. I mean, I don't think he's a fan of workload or GPS, unless I'm wrong. But one is when we talk about people being fatigued, and let's just say, as Bob stated before, they need a day off or they need to cut workload by 20%, that practice session, whatever. My question is, are the players coming in day one physically prepared to last the stresses of a season? Or are they coming in at a deficit, so they're behind the 8 ball already? So on that practice day, when we're saying you got to cut the workload by 20%, if they were in shape, would that conversation never even be occurring? That's the first question I have. And I don't know, I'm just throwing this out for discussion. The second question I have, and Derek, I don't know the stats like because you're looking at them more often. I would think, especially in preseason, the people who get the highest workload are the wide receivers and defensive backs, right? Because if a wide receiver goes down, everybody has to pick up those reps, right, to make up for the people who went down. But if you look at the ACL injuries, I don't think wide receivers are number one, or defensive backs are number one. So is fatigue and workload really the problem with these injuries? Because the people theoretically running the highest volumes aren't the ones with the highest injuries.
I think the defensive backs and safeties and cornerbacks and all that, they are a little bit up there for especially the non-contact stuff, Rob. And then you'll have linebackers, tight ends, there as well, and then obviously the line itself. But certainly I've seen, especially Achilles, definitely.
My point is that if we're going to talk about workload, the majority of the people, this is my perception, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. The majority of people getting hurt are not the ones with the highest workloads.
I guess it
as far as
on
distance.
I would think it depends on how you define workload too, because if you have somebody if it's mileage, then yes.
I'm talking about mileage, right?
Yeah, but if it's direction change and contact, I mean, that's another quality, I think. So it's so difficult to quantify, I guess, right? James, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. From my perspective, I kind of like, it's like a zoom in, zoom out, fractal kind of type patterning, if you want to think of it in terms. I think we have more data, more awareness of causes and effects behind a lot of things on a micro scale on controlled situations. But when we put it all together, that's where it's kind of, there's a monkey wrench in it. And so kind of like a unity, cohesive, self-regulating type issues, like as when I look at it. Because I see, you know, like the turf, like everything's contextual. It depends on context. And it's all right. It's just when and what's time and place. Like mostly at my level at the high school, the things that mostly arise for injuries or like, are you training through full range of motion, developing the work capacities and specific work capacities of certain type of abilities. And then, you know, as you progress up, you know, you do see coaches working together more, but then sometimes like the coaches are they doing too much? And with like the ambitions of both coaches are going head to head each other. And not working with each other or fully on one page. And so it's kind of hard, you know, you have many different experts in many different fields, and then they can all be not on the same page or with each other. And so, you know, I see it as a manifestation from like when we see it on the grand scale, it's just a manifestation of failure on a micro. If we can just kind of cohesively work together, there's communication up and down, like pretty much that's it. Like if I feel like it's kind of, that's the issue. It's just kind of like up and down, not cohesively really listening to each other, instead of just kind of covering the basics.
Well, it's really interesting. If we look at like, say, ACLs and the canary in the coal mine, ACLs and Achilles, it seems like it's happening in bunches. And I don't know why. And I keep going back to what Rob explained to me one time about shoulder injuries was you're basically filtering out the people who aren't resilient. And it's like a natural selection. So they'll go through, and at certain times in the season, we'll see like 5 ACLs. And then last week, I think we didn't see any. So is it a time factor where it's like Squid Game, where you're like wiping out, you know, certain amounts of people based on their preparedness or their genetics or whatever, or maybe what's happening in their practice. I think it's really interesting. Obviously, there's a confluence of factors as you've identified, James, and people aren't good at coordinating and working together. But I'm curious to get other people's thoughts on that. Omar, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think many people mentioned about it's the trickle down effect of from the top working its way down. I've been in a director of athletics job now for 5 months, and first thing I did was bring in a director of strength and conditioning, and also bring in a director of sports psychology, and trying to mesh in some of those pieces for the student athletes we're supposed to serve. I went through a football season where we didn't do a good job of monitoring workload capacity on our student athletes. And there was a lot of button heads with the approach to strength and conditioning. The coach had his own guy who doesn't have a background in strength and conditioning. I think he was a YouTube trainer. And so there's a lot of stuff that he's trying to throw out there and not really knowing how to program correctly. I think, you know, success comes in programming and planning that stuff out. And so it's tough because my vision for turning these athletic programs are that we all work together and make sure that people do their jobs. And so our strength coach comes in and does his job. I have meetings with coaches every week. The issue that I'm encountering, to somebody else's point, I have some coaches there that have been 38 years, been coaches 38 years there, and they're kind of just stuck in what they're used to doing. And they have this concept, if it ain't broke, why fix it? Or they have this thought process that kids are going to get hurt, and that's just the way it goes. And so, but I'm coming from a place of like, there is a way to prevent some of these things from happening, and making sure there's some readiness that is happening way prior to the start of the season, so that our student athletes can compete at the highest level when they're when they are in season. But it's like pulling teeth, man. It's tough. And so right now I'm going through a lot of changeover, just because, you're either going to get on the bus and do it this way, or, you just might not be the best fit for what we're trying to do right now. And so there's just a hodgepodge of different thought processes, and not to say that someone's right or wrong. They're just used to doing it a certain way. And for me, it's just, this is the way we're going to do it. And I truly believe in it, and we're going to move forward with it. So
that's interesting. The whole human resources piece, Omar, is so critical in finding the right people. Like, I would feel very comfortable pretty much having anybody on this call work with me, because I know that most of you have been on these calls for the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm like, wow, either they really like me, or, you really want to contribute and learn. So, but yeah, it was interesting. I don't know if you guys saw that whole thing about the thing that leaked about Urban Meyer, and how he was telling all his coaches, you're all losers, right? When they would lose it, you're a loser, right? Doing the Oprah thing. And it's like, well, didn't you hire these guys? Didn't you bring these people in? And now you're blaming them. So I think finding the right people to delegate these things, and Rob and I talk about this all the time, because, Rob has, I don't know, thousands of people that he has to make sure do a good job. But I don't think people think about that as much. I'll get Nick to jump in, but I want Rob to comment on like hiring people and finding good people and making sure they stay good. Nick, you had your hand up there.
Yes, thank you. So I think my big question for you folks is kind of to tie some things together. What do you do in the case? So I'm a grad intern at the University of Rhode Island, and we have a lot of data that shows like decreased counter movement jump performance and other monitoring across our football team this season. But our coach is a very old school coach who, even in the playoffs, was still running 3-hour practices. So we explained to him that it might be better to give the guys a little bit of rest, and we see people getting beat up and injuries down the stretch. What do you do when it's almost like banging your head against a wall and you can show all of the data and they still don't take action, knowing full well that, no, I'm not the head, but if they don't do well, even though we're an FCS school, my boss may get fired. I mean, that's not going to happen, but it could.
Who wants to tackle that one? Maybe Coach Alejo?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, it's a pretty simple answer for me. I mean, it's the same old story, right? The guy above you, Nick's got to be able to support you to be able to go do that. I'm lucky. The guy I work for, I've now known for 40 years. He was a decathlete at UCLA, so he was I consider a sub-elite athlete at the time, and he knows how important that area is. At the same time, we've already taken some of those things out of the responsibility of the head coaches. Like, you're not going to be responsible for the conditioning. You're not going to punish and try to go behavioral modifications with runs. We're not doing that. And, that's the first part. And so, I mean, I think everybody here will tell you, it's not a headbutt thing, because if you don't have any backing, there is no headbutting. They're going to do whatever they want to do. And so that's been the conundrum for years. And I've said this also too, as hard as it's been on strength and conditioning over the years, the trainers have had it way worse and for a longer time, right? So, somehow you've got to go in there and separate that and let them know, what's going to occur. And you made a good point, Nick. I don't know about injury and fatigue, but I do know about fatigue and decrement in performance. So that's a kind of quiet assassin, like somebody gets ran down on the sideline just enough, right? If they're fatigued, I mean, you're looking at, tenths of a second that make a difference. They're not jumping high, they're not jumping as high or running as fast. So that's the other part of that. And I also will say that I know that Mick Hughes and Tim Hewitt, who are big ACL guys that I follow and trust, have literally found really no link to fatigue and ACL injury. Haven't seen it yet. Now, that argument, I guess you could take a few different ways. still, I think the killer of fatigue is just performance decrement in general. Guys getting banged up and so sore and tired that they lose their passion, they lose their interest, and they just can't move around. I mean, if you ask me, I think it's intensity of training that really contributes more to injuries, only because nobody's out there getting hurt going 50% or 75% for that matter, right? I mean, or that person that runs into that leg, they're not also going. So I think there may be a bigger causal relationship between intensity of preparation than mileage. You know what I mean? Like looking at with catapult and all that, I've always looked at load per minute, the intensity of the drill. That's the thing I've been looking at. But anyway, long story short, to what Nick was talking about, again, that's a leadership thing, man. And you've also got to not put yourself in a place to say, well, this is the right thing to do and we're going to do it and all that, when you really know that that's not going to happen. You got to have to back out of that one until you get somebody in charge.
I wanted to jump to Adrian, because Adrian, you seem to have your ear to the ground on like some of the private sector stuff going on. And do you think that's part of the problem, when people go away from their teams or their organizations? Do you think there's some deficits there because of, people like you're saying, people aren't qualified, people aren't experienced, they just want to have fun, they want to keep their client? What is that contribution to this problem with injuries?
It's funny how Omar was saying about you got the YouTube trainer, and especially being in the private sector, I see it all the time. So yeah, like I guess the best example I can use is when I was training a couple of college kids down, and Stafford was still here at the time. This is before he went to the Rams, and I ran into a couple of guys. They obviously played for the Lions, and one of the kids was from LSU. I can't remember the guys. It was like a running back, tight end, quarterback, whatever. And so we got into the conversation. I'm like, hey guys, what you guys doing? Oh, we're waiting for Stafford. And then I'm meeting up with my trainer. Well, who's your guy? Oh, he played at Saginaw Valley. He played at Central Michigan. Oh, okay, cool. Who is the guy? And I kind of know the guy, and it's like, well, what does he have you to do? So we just got in the conversation. He's like, oh, this and this and this. I'm like, why? Well, he did it at his school, or his strength coach taught him this. Or, I mean, stop me if you've ever heard this story before. So, or I got into one of the guys was like, oh, my uncle played in high school. I'm like, well, does he know what he's doing? Well, he was all city. I'm like, Jesus Christ. I'm like, oh, okay. So yeah, and I guess we come hanging out with you guys, like Sam and I talking about it all the time. I'm the type of person to say, Derek, if you were, say, with the Chiefs or Rams or whatever, and I'm training someone, I was just taught the habit of reach out to you. All right, what is Tyreek doing? What is, Nicole's doing? I mean, that's my thought process. But yeah, a lot of guys try to quote unquote reinvent the wheel. So plus they're trying to, get their clout up through certain NFL players also, which a lot of guys are trying to do, just make their name.
When you mention the uncle, I always think of Uncle Rico from Napoleon Dynamite. Ryan Banta, I want to get you on here. Ryan, we just glad to see you. We know you've had some health stuff you're dealing with. We just want to say we're all pulling for you. We all care about you. We just want you to, get through this. And if you can give us an update, that'd be great. If not, if you just want to jump in, that's great too.
Well, yeah, so having surgery at the end of January, and had a lot of people, specifically people who shall remain nameless, but are on this call, who have really helped out a lot and been very gracious and helpful. And I cannot express how much I appreciate all you guys. And one of those things that's kind of interesting is the world of COVID and the coronavirus, creates opportunities. And one of the opportunities is friendship through these kind of virtual calls and all that kind of stuff. And I am so overwhelmingly appreciative of all the help and support and people kind of giving advice and direction and connection with medical folks and all that kind of stuff. So it's been really, really useful in that way. And, it's weird because with the stuff that, got going on, it's like one thing to, have things going on and then having a situation where, you're going to come out of it maybe a little bit different, and it's weird to be in that position, but I know over the long haul that it'll be better than what the other option would be if I didn't do anything. So, it's kind of kind of one of those situations. But, the biggest thing is I want to be as much of myself as I can be for my family and for my friends and those people first, and then for my career and all that kind of stuff. But in particular to injuries and all that kind of stuff, one of the things I found pretty interesting is Jason Avedijian, who now I think has a job at Clemson working there. He's done a lot of studies with concussions and how it correlates or relates to increased percentages of chance of ACL. And I don't want to screw up his data, but I think he said something to the effect of a 30% increased chance. So when you're looking at a sport like football, where there are a lot of opportunities for concussions, and then talking about the mechanoreceptors in the ACL or in the knee itself, and then you lose, that connection with the brain, or it's not as strong. I think you see that makes a lot of sense to me from a layman's terms, that might be some of the stuff that we're seeing. The other thing that, I could tell you from my very small neck of the woods in the high school setting, we had a rapid increase in injuries that I've never seen in my entire career. And some of that's probably limited options of things we were allowed to do. Like we were not allowed to go inside to lift weights. So we had to do strength training, a weight room without walls. We weren't allowed to do any kind of partner stretching or any kind of thing like that. And I know a lot of you guys poo-poo static stretching. But even after practice, hey, you can't really touch within this 15-minute window contact. Obviously, as the coronavirus has morphed literally and politically, we're able to do some more things and injuries have gone down. And I'm hoping that with some winter conditioning and things like that, we'll see kind of getting back to what our normal was in terms of lack of injuries in my program. I had previous to last year, I had in 12 years only 3 hamstring pulls. I mean, we've had multiple state relays and state champs individually and all this kind of stuff. And last year I had 3 of my 4 best athletes. And so then I had to work backwards from there because of not having the strength training, not having the preparation. If it rained, we were not allowed to do anything inside at all. So then every day that we got to go out, it's like, all right, well, then we're going to get after it. Well, I've never had that intensity load like that where it's a high low. And so managing that was crazy. So when I look at the NFL, I think of, and I think it was Adrian or somebody said, how many of these guys work out in the off season? And I can tell you that when we had the St. Louis Rams, we had the stupid pants off of them to give us money for lying to us and becoming the LA Rams. Sorry, Crocky, but you're never going to be around me without getting slapped. Speaking of Uncle Rico, he looks just like that guy. But nevertheless, the Rams would come in the 24-hour fitness and they would train in the off season. So Grant Wistrom was in there, Dre Bly, Orlando Pace, and me just being kind of a bit of a, still trying to hang on to my glory day gym rat kind of situation. And I'm like, man, this is very unimpressive what these guys are doing here in the weight room. I mean, Orlando Pace spent more time on the elliptical machine than he did anything else, and Dre Bly, was on the bench. And I don't know if you guys have ever been to a 24-hour fitness, but back in the day, they only had like 2 benches for this whole massive weight room. So I'm standing around waiting to use the bench because I'm not going to do anything before I start my upper body day because I'm a big meathead. And finally I got fed up with Dre Bly and I'm like, hey man, can I jump in? And he's like, yeah, man, this is, 205. I go, all right, I'll warm up with 205. My buddy's like, do you know who that guy is? I go, yeah, it's Dre Bly. He's like, yeah, it's Dre Bly. I go, Dre Bly needs to lift more. I'm like, what's going on here? But then, Dre goes into the basketball gym at 24-hour fitness and he can like standing dunk at 5'7", and I'm like, oh, that's why he's in the NFL. So, it's amazing. And again, that's what, 15 years ago or whatever. But it is amazing how little organized things happen in the off season for them. And we're just at the whim of a personal trainer and some uncle who used to maybe look at the weight room when he was in high school, and things like that. And it's crazy that happens all the way up to the pros, but it does specifically in the off season. And then you take account for concussions, surface, shoes, and all these kind of things. You're going to find injuries, and it blows my mind though. Like, what was it? $4 million they were going to spend to figure out hamstring problems for the NFL, which is, I would think is the number 3 or number 2 season ender for most athletes. And that's all the money that they're going to invest. To me, I just find that wild. So anyway, stream of consciousness. I appreciate you guys getting on here and chatting with me, and it feels good to see all your faces.
Yeah, very good point. Let's find out if they train first before we spend $4 million. That's a pretty expensive survey. I want to shift here because I got Mike Hurst on, and I want to talk a bit about Olympics and all the crazy stuff going on. We got Clint here. Clint is involved in the Winter Olympics too. And so, Mike, what's going on with the Olympics in terms of like the political stuff? And, you know, I saw that a friend of mine said, oh, Olympic weightlifting is going to be gone as of 2028, and boxing. And I think it was modern pentathlon because somebody punched a horse. So there's all this crazy stuff going on. And they're going to put in skateboarding, climbing, and surfing because I guess it's more commercial. But, you know, is track and field at risk, do you think, with this type of stuff going on? Because they're saying weightlifting, it's the drugs, right? We're going to get rid of them. What are your thoughts, Mike? You got to unmute yourself there, Mike.
Mute.
There you
go. Okay, sorry, guys. Now, I don't think track and field is at any kind of risk at all, nor is swimming. But the politicians are talking about boycotting the upcoming Winter Olympics in China because of various adventurisms, as well as the harassment of a Chinese female tennis player. How do you, I mean, they're talking about not attending, the politicians talking about not attending the Olympics, Winter Olympics. How can you refuse an invitation that hasn't even been issued? Because you don't just turn up to these things if you're a poly. You have to be invited. And they're not being invited. So what are they saying? And really, honestly, they're just a bunch of freeloaders anyway. They will not even be, their absence will not even be noticed, I don't think. But what was the other question?
Well, just in terms of, you know, the sports themselves, we talked a bit about the sports being dropped. You know, and I assume it's some of it is scandal, but I think a lot of it is just the commercialization.
No, I think, look, if you got weightlifting's got an administrative problem, that they've got a lot of pretty ordinary characters high up in the executive, and you just can't get rid of them. There are some really good people in international weightlifting. And it's a problem. At the moment, it's not part of the Los Angeles 28 Olympic program. It's not on the program, as you said. And it's because the International Weightlifting Federation just can't get their house in order. They keep having people appointed with really bad track records, particularly in the area of, I don't want to get sued for any of this, and I don't want you to get sued either, but just in terms of cleaning up doping, which is a real big issue in weightlifting still, there are people there who have sat on their hands, let's put it that way, in terms of trying to remedy the problem. It is a huge problem. The other problem is that they then going to turn around and change the Olympic motto from stronger, higher, faster. You know, you get rid of the stronger. Okay, good. I think it had to go. It's been on thin ice for at least 5 or 6 Olympics. And there are some people on the IOC executive, including the Vice President, John Coates from Australia, who are they're just sick of it, absolutely sick of it. So I don't know whether there are any positives in Tokyo for weightlifting. I don't think there were. So at the grassroots, probably the message is getting through. But in terms of the power plays on the IWF, it's not good. And I've got friends who've been head coaches for the Australian Olympic team for weightlifting who are now talking about retiring from the sport. And that would be a blow. I don't know what else.
What about China? Do you think they will feel slighted because they invest a lot in weightlifting and they do well in weightlifting? Do you think that's going to be a problem?
It's going to be a problem for China. It's going to be a problem for a lot of people, but China's got bigger problems, bigger fish to fry right now, haven't they? You know, with all this military adventurism and whatnot, and people sort of threatening to just make them persona non grata. And Russia as well. You know, they're an issue, and places like Bulgaria. But in terms of China, I think they're just one vote. You know, that one vote in 200 or something. So their capacity for influence to get weightlifting back on the books is somewhat limited. I might be naive there, but I think that you know, they've contributed in their own way to the downfall of weightlifting over time, over the years. I don't think they've got a leg to stand on if they're arguing that it should be back in the games. I just think mostly it's an issue of internal politics and power plays with not good situation at the IWF.
Yeah. Clint, I'm going to get you to talk a bit. If Clint goes off the air, it's because he's in China and he said something. Whereabouts are you, Clint?
In Beijing. I'm in Beijing.
Okay, so speak carefully and tell us what your thoughts are on the Winter Olympics.
Yeah, we've come up with like a whole set of code words anytime I talk to my family, like, you know, the C word and the V word, you know, anything we talk about, we have to use code or else we'll get kicked off. So
now I want to know what the C and the V word are.
Yeah.
Anyways, give us your thoughts carefully.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, what was the question there? You're just asking about?
Just about, the Winter Olympics are coming. I know you've been involved in ice hockey. There was some talk about ice hockey, the Chinese team being not allowed to play because of foreign players, or they're not good enough, or what's going on?
Yeah, so it sounds like China's been approved by the IIHF for the Olympics. There was some debate as to which players they were going to use. There was sort of three groups of players, whether they were going to use the native or national team players or heritage players, basically Canadian or American players with some Chinese background, or whether they were going to be allowed to use some international players. So for those of you who don't know, China was given an auto bid for ice hockey as the host country for the Olympics. So that's been a big topic. It sounds like just in the last week or so, the IIHF did say that China is going to be allowed to play, and I think some of that had to do with some passports as well. They had to approve passports for some of the heritage players. So the national team wasn't as strong. They didn't want to put the national team in to keep the scores kind of respectable. And then I think, so aside from Team China, which now looks like they're going to be a part of the games for sure, we're still waiting to hear if the NHL is going to participate. So I think there's still some debate if the NHL is going to send their players.
How is the situation with the pandemic there? Does it seem like things are under control, and having all these people, travel to China, is that going to be an issue or a concern? Or
yeah, it's been really interesting that the country's been really pretty tightly closed. I would call it almost like a bubble nationally for the past 2 years, and then also with Beijing as almost another bubble inside the country. So travel is really limited. Like I haven't been home for 2 years now, and no one can come visit. And actually, all the international people here is really dwindled. There's very few people here. When I got here, there was a lot of coaches. We would, you could go out for dinner on a weekend, and you would see, I would see a whole bunch of coaches that I know from around the world, and everyone's gone now. So there's barely anyone left. I know maybe like 1 or 2 people that are left, and so it's really been interesting here, and it's pretty quiet. Everything's pretty quiet. Everything's shut down. There's no sports, no concerts, nothing. I think everyone's just waiting for the Olympics, and we'll see what happens. So it's definitely been pretty tight here. It's been pretty interesting and pretty wild.
So hopefully you get to see some, familiar faces, some Canadian people when they travel there, and you get access to them. I don't know. Will you?
I have no idea. Like we're only 2 months out, and I've been waiting for things to ramp up, and really it's been really quiet. They're putting up a lot of security around the venues, and so there's lots of fences and these types of things going up, and we're starting to close down a lot of the venues now. They're getting ready just to prepare for everything for the games, but everything's been so quiet. It's really hard to say. And then now again, like they're not sure if NHL players are going to come, and so it's really interesting. And I keep waiting. I mean, we're into December now. I thought things would start heating up November, December, but really like it's been so quiet, and so I think everyone's just kind of waiting to see what happens with the Olympics and with that C word going around and all this kind of stuff. So
well, this is the best internet connection I've had with you in the last 2 years. So obviously you're avoiding those C and V words very well. Rob, what I want to jump in is there's been some mention, and even Ryan, about COVID. How are we doing? All right, you think, we talked a bit about this. Is it going to become an endemic, and we're just going to, have to get vaccinations? And what are your thoughts moving into 2022? Are you planning for anything different?
Well, in New York State, starting tomorrow, we have a mask mandate in every venue, closed venue, unless that venue, has a requirement of everyone entering is vaccinated. So that's starting tomorrow. It's going to last in New York State. That's going to last through January 15th. I guess they want to see what this new variant is, even if it's more, and I'm far from a COVID expert. But this new variant, even if it is more contagious, is it as serious as the Delta variant with regards to hospitalizations and deaths, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? I don't think we know enough yet. I just think there seems to be a push with this new variant where people are getting booster shots and people in the United States are getting vaccinated. So those numbers are going up. Will we hit herd immunity? I don't know. So, it's just a wait and see game, and as soon as this variant's over, there's the next one coming around. I do think it'll be, and I have no support for this. I think it'll be an endemic, as you stated. I think we're probably going to wind up having just like a flu shot. We'll probably wind up getting a COVID shot annually and take it from there, or the recommendations of a COVID shot annually and take it from there.
Thanks. Mike Hurst, I just wanted to ask, how are things going there? I know you're a little slower on the V's, but it seems like Aussies don't have a problem using the C word. Mike?
Yeah, I'm here, but I think what have I done?
It's okay.
I've lost the image, but it's okay.
Did you get a second vaccination?
Yeah,
okay.
I did. I'm waiting for a booster. I can't get one till January the 18th. I don't know. I think it's got to do with the amount of time between shots, the recommended dose. Yeah, there's no problem. What was? Sorry, Derek. What was the question again?
Just we're always wondering, how are things different in Australia with regard to how they're handling the pandemic and any restrictions? Can you train? Can you compete?
You can train now. The gyms are all open. Most gyms will have, you've got to be double vaccinated. Competition is the same. You've got to show you've got double vaxxed. I'm talking about on the track or the football field. Interstate borders are starting to lift. Queensland's border between New South Wales and Queensland is now open for the first time as of today, but you still have to show that you've had double vaxxed, and you need to have a test, like a bloody broom up your nose or something like this to within 72 hours of trying to cross the border. And once you do up to Queensland, if you want to go up there, you've got to have another one 5 days later. It's certainly not unrestricted, but it is more open than it was before. Every state has had issues. I'm about to fly down to Tasmania because they've got a bunch of track meets down there. So my whole squad and I have been invited and fully paid for. So we'll do that, but we still also have to have the test 72 hours before, and may well have to have another test while we're down there. So it's cautious, and it's responsible caution by the medical fraternity and the government.
Well, I think that's how it's moving forward. I don't know how it is for everybody on this call, but is it getting to a point where this is manageable and you don't feel like you're as constrained? Jim, how are things going on your end?
Well, I mean, I'm not far from Rob. I mean, I'm in Queens, so I deal with all the same New York City stuff right now. I got my booster, so I mean, it all depends how far down the rabbit hole you want to go. I just I'm good. I feel comfortable going most places. I don't mind throwing a mask on if I need to throw the mask on. The gyms seem to be doing what they can do. I'll be honest with you, because I'm not affiliated with the team right now. I'm not quite sure, what's going on with, with MLB. They obviously, in talking to guys, keeping in touch with guys, and even doing the combines that we did, we didn't really run into any problems. And I'm not quite sure how all this is going to affect next year for everybody. They got to sort out the collective bargaining agreement before they start worrying about, that stuff. And it becomes incumbent upon the medical personnel, the medical advisory committee in MLB, Dr. Gary Green at UCLA, who's, kind of the main doctor with that. And then every, organizational medical staff just kind of adhering to the rules and creating what they need to create. It'll be interesting to see, obviously last year spring training was still compromised for everybody as far as the number of people they brought in. They weren't running minor league camp and major league camp concurrently. They let the major league guys get out of there, and then they brought the minors in for a shortened season. I have no idea if that's on the table for them at all right now. Probably more of a wait and see, because there might be a minor league season. It might only be half a major league season. So, it all depends once they get done fighting about money and everything else that they're gonna trying to sort out with the bargaining agreement.
Hey, Derek, on that note, just to follow up what Jim said, I know some major league team physicians that have written Major League Baseball stating that, to prohibit the players from seeing the team physicians and the medical staff is essentially malpractice, right? Like, how do you have someone perform surgery on someone and then they can't do follow-up visits? So I know there is a push on the medical aspect with regards to this collective bargaining agreement to at least allow the players to see their medical staff. How it winds up, though, is to be seen.
Yeah, Rob, too, and to your point, I'm not sure how much of that. Well, obviously, right now, because it's a lockout versus a strike, it's been imposed by owners and / the league. I came into baseball right after the last work stoppage, so I didn't go through that. And this is so this is new to everybody. I don't quite grasp the strategy of going into the lockout at this point. MLB winter meetings, they were canceled this week. I was supposed to be in Orlando. I'd come back from Orlando today. I'm still going to go down to the winter meetings and participate in that. And, when the lockout went into effect at 12:01 a.m. last Friday morning, I had an email from MLB events at 12:19 saying, winter meetings are canceled, your room's canceled, you don't have to do anything else. I really thought that the one exception would be that if you had players that were in some sort of somewhere in the rehab process, that they would be able to stay connected, so that as contracted players to an organization, they would be able to communicate with the team personnel. I find that a little bit unusual. I find that, especially the rehab guys, if nobody else, I find that a little bit unusual.
Eric Kozlowski, how are things for you from a workflow point of view? And you guys are managing okay at the academy?
Yeah, we're doing okay. I don't remember the exact date, but they made it mandatory that all the cadets had to be vaccinated. There's a few out there that are requesting either religious or medical exemptions, but it doesn't sound like those are going to get approved. There's a couple avenues for it, and I don't know exactly what they are, but we had hardly any positives. We didn't have a positive since August. On our team, we did have a bunch of upper respiratory infections we hadn't had over the last year and a half, but I think what do we not have positives because we weren't testing as much as before, or is it just not around us and we're in our own hole or our own pod, if you want to call it that? A lot of kids, which was mostly okay with us, that they wanted to be grown-ups and treat their own colds and coughs on their own with over-the-counter stuff, and I think that was a good learning moment for a student athlete. But they got to the point where they really weren't feeling very well. They were seeing, and everybody who was seen was tested for COVID. I battled a sinus infection. I thought I tested negative for COVID in late October, and gone through a couple of antibiotics to get over a sinus infection that seems to be lingering with me. But lots of upper respiratory infections that were viral but non-COVID for us. A little worse than a regular cold. But it seemed less stressful for us as far as, we weren't testing everybody every day. The only people that got tested were those who were not fully vaccinated, with their two vaccinations, and the medical staff at our place was all allowed to get the booster, and I got mine I think last Wednesday, so I've had the third Pfizer shot. It seemed a little bit easier with not having to worry about that all the testing and was taken out of our hands and done by the cadet wing and by the clinic. We had to send out reminders to get these guys to test, but it was nice that we only had a couple that had a test every week, and that were really non-factors, young kids that weren't on the travel roster and that would really affect anybody.
That's great. That's great to hear. Ryan Banta, how are things for you day to day in terms of coaching, teaching, everything manageable?
Yeah, in fact, very few cases in our building. I do believe that's because, a lot of kids and a lot of parents got vaccinated. Interestingly enough, or ironically enough, my daughter's actually on quarantine due to exposure, but had a negative test, a couple days ago, just to be able to be safe and hang out with the family. We figured we gave it enough time for incubation and stuff like that. So she's on a 10-day lockdown because it was a unique situation where her pod, they eat lunch and they have their masks off, and lunch is more than 15 minutes. But I did not lose one athlete throughout the cross-country season. Our team made it to the state championship. You're in a large situation where people are breathing on each other on a start line. There were no issues at all. No major issues to any of the teams that we have that are competing, whether it was football or volleyball or anything like that. So on the COVID end, it's been, knock on wood, pretty good. And I think a lot of that has to, boil down to the fact that people are being smart. Now, not smart was my father, who decided he wanted to, in retirement, start driving limos again and not wear a mask and have all these mouth breathers, blowing air around there. So he had a serious problem with COVID. And he's double vaccinated. My mom got her triple or booster shot the day that he found out that he had tested positive, and thank goodness he ended up getting the the antibody infusion, because he was going down a path that was actually really, really scary. And my dad has all sorts of comorbidities, blood pressure, type 2 diabetic, kidney transplant recipient. So people like that are still experiencing challenges and difficulties. And we're in a state where, I don't know, for the international viewers of this video, Missouri is like the wild, wild west when it comes to lack of any belief that the COVID is a real thing and all that kind of stuff. So it's very different down here than in other locations. Going back kind of a ways, one of the things that does kind of bother me about the Olympic stuff with the weight lifting and replacing it with other sports is the fact that like the name of the sport is Olympic weightlifting, and like it's been around for a long time. And and they're like, why isn't it popular? It's not getting views. Well, that's because you have to go like matrix level deep to find the channel or the streaming service that it's on to watch that sport. Every time I turned on television, and I knew what the track stuff was just because the track community is so tight. But if I wasn't really into the track community like that, and I wanted to watch track and field, it'd be pretty difficult to watch it, and especially watch it and not have it spoiled for me. When we talk about like the stuff they put on television, it was like, how much beach volleyball can they show us, both men and women? I mean, I like volleyball, but I actually like the real volleyball game. No offense to anybody who's a beach volleyball person here. And then I question like, well, why are they even watching that? Are they really caring about the sport, or do we care because the young ladies and young men are barely dressed? What is it about that? And it's like, well, it doesn't have good ratings. Well, if you don't put it on TV, it's not going to have good ratings. You put something on TV, it has better ratings. That's just the reality. And I know they're trying to make money and do all that kind of stuff. But I thought the biggest sham or shame of this particular Olympics, when it came to the different sports, is the fact that like they moved a lot of this stuff, which makes sense, to streaming, but made it very difficult to be able to find the programming in sport that you wanted to watch with any kind of consistency.
So you're proposing new outfits for Olympic weightlifting. That's the gist of that.
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody wants to see some of those folks, doing, weightlifting in those outfits. But that's what's so silly is it's like, to me, I don't care. It's the Olympics. Don't mess with wrestling. Like they were, wrestling is a big one that they've been talking about for a long time. Like that's an OG Olympic sport. I know that there's all these things like gaming, and all the stuff that they're going to throw in the Olympics. But to me, I'm like, that's something different. That's a different thing. Rock climbing, awesome. Yeah, you can throw that in there. I have no problem with that. But if they start doing like air guitar contests and things like that in the Olympics, then we get to the point of it being a clown show and losing, these opportunities for these people who dedicate their life and in many ways are still amateurs because of the lack of the ability to make money off of the sport. And this is the one time that they get to really highlight a very unique, internationally based sport. And what I mean by internationally is like different countries are good at different things. And that's really cool. Like Iran has success in wrestling, and that's a big deal to them. China, it's weightlifting, different sports, it's equestrian sports, Argentina, and it's like for them, that's a sense of national pride. And I feel like the international games need to stay international in terms of the representation of
competition. Thank you for your thoughts.
Ryan, we can go back to those tighty whitey singlets from like the 1970s. I mean, if Alexiev could pull it off, I'm sure Lasha can.
I know. And I just have these visions of people having accidents in those outfits in a variety of different ways. But it's one of those things where, again, it's like, I don't need to see that much sand volleyball. Like when they have on ESPN in Texas Hold'em poker was a big thing for a while. And I'm like, this is on TV, or like playing, bean bags or whatever that is on there instead of international track. It just frustrates me.
All right. We got some questions or some contributions from Nick, Omar, and James. Nick, you want to jump in?
Geeks.
Yeah, I was just saying really good points in regards to the fact about weightlifting and exposure. I think that comes down to like a couple different sports, not just weightlifting, like Coach Bonta mentioned in regards to track. I mean, I personally wasn't exposed to weightlifting until I went to college, and there was a team I didn't really know it was a sport. So.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's just on how they present it. And I mean, maybe weightlifting could be involved in promoting and marketing their sport better. It's so hard to say. Omar.
I was just going to add to what Ryan was talking about in regards to the COVID stuff at the high school level. For us, it's just more the indoor sports stuff that's become more making sure we're testing twice a week, and just those pieces there where we can control what we do, but other people worrying about what other people. It's not in California. It's not a universal thing. Me being in the private sector, we can control a lot of the things that we can do. But a lot of the schools in our conference are public schools, and unfortunately, they can't require or request records from kids about vaccinations, and so right now, hoop's a big three-headed monster, just because it originally came out that the officials are responsible for making sure the kids wear masks on the floor, and so far I've seen about 15 games. One of them is where the officials actually stepped in and told them to keep their masks on. Otherwise, they're not even bothering with those things. So, but we'll get to a better place, and hopefully, with these booster shots and people being a little bit more responsible, I think we'll get to a better place sooner than later.
Great. Well, glad you're in charge there, Omar. Good to see you. James, you want to finish up?
Yeah. Like here, I'm in Seattle, so we're pretty strict here as in how I'm being how it's restricting me. It hasn't really, to be honest, I'm more private too. It hasn't even really restricted me for the most part. Like, I mean, private, I can have kids come in and we're all just working together. Now, when I go and I'm working for the school that I'm particularly coaching at, it's Garfield High School. We're pretty notorious for sending NBA players out, like just developing them here and going out. And our attitude towards it is like always kind of like, we don't like wearing masks, but we're always got our eyes peeled for, whoever's around and stuff like that. And so, we do what we got to do in order to do what we have to do, but we're always going to try to do what we can without it for a comfort base. In regards to the Olympics, money tends to make problems go away. And with that, a sprinter that I'm managing his weights for, he's running a 10-1, and we're trying to figure out how to make money and how to get more money into sprinting. And he came up with the ideas of maybe promoting it like boxing, like, get a bunch of shit talking going on, and you kind of promote that. It kind of hypes it up, builds it up, and then you do it, even though we know a lot of it's just show, but it just gets the commotion going. It kind of gets buzz and so on and so forth, where what we know behind the scenes, it's a little different. So, that's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, they need a Jake Paul of sprinting to go and challenge people or something like that, right? To help promote the sport. Rob, I want you to kind of finish off here. I had touched on this idea that like finding good people and getting good people to work for you and putting these people together and managing them. What are some thoughts, some parting thoughts here on how the people in this group can think about that and
I mean, it's a lot to do. I mean, I think when you get into a situation, you have to, assess it, right? You have to do maybe something like a SWOT system. What, in the environment you're in, or the team you're with, or whatever the department you're going to run, what's the strengths, what's the weaknesses, what's the opportunities, what's the threats, and then you've got to establish your needs, what it is you need to do to change, what it is that's there that you like. You have to essentially, the toughest thing is probably to establish the culture you want, because if you could establish a good culture, I think a lot of falls into place. I think you have to hold people accountable. I don't think that happens as often as it should. And accountability, I've been taught, like, that I always used to think you have to be fair, you have to treat everybody fairly. I don't do that anymore. I think you have to be right, so you do what's best for your organization, best for your team, best for your department. And so there are different levels of violations, so to speak, and they may occur with different levels of punishment or whatever. And I think you just have to establish a culture. You have to establish discipline and accountability. And the end goal to me is if you can get people accountable with regards to their responsibilities, that leads into self-accountability, right? Where they care and they care about their job, they care about the performance, et cetera. And that rolls through. As far as hiring, I'd rather hire through relationships. I'm a big believer in having the best team, which may correspond to having some of the best individuals. I would take someone with a little bit less talent, but who fit the team better than someone who had more talent, who could be disruptive. And then, you go through recommendations, all those types of things. People come in, you interview, but you have to go through recommendations. And then I would check on the people making the recommendations as well. Sometimes you've been through this, Derek, you've heard the stories, I'm sure everybody else has. Sometimes people are highly recommended for a position because the facility, the team, where they want them out of there, right? So, so it's just a lot of things, but I would just say, look at your strengths and weaknesses, establish the culture that you want, try to get the people that fit that culture and hold them accountable for their job. And the last thing I'll say about accountability is check to see if someone's really not performing well, or if you're not providing them with the tools that they need to perform well, because those are definitely two different scenarios, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that's very valuable advice, I think. And I just want to thank everybody for jumping on. I haven't seen everybody for a while. I was in New York City a month ago and I happened to get out with Rob, but I'd love to be able to see people in person more. So thanks again for jumping on. I appreciate you all. And hopefully we can jump on again, maybe one more time through the holidays or something, and just catch up with everybody.
Sounds good, Derek.
Holiday.
A lot, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks a
Derek.
lot.
Everybody
Take
be well.
care.
Stay safe.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Have a good one.
Derek.
Merry Christmas, Happy New Year coming up.
Take
To
care.
all.
Don't say CRV.